One and all, in today's fast moving environment where you often have only minutes to connect, using stories help you make a memorable impression quickly and become more unrivaled communicator. This is Pravartan Tatte, delighted and privileged to welcome you all to this 7th edition of Orange City Literature Festival organized by Raisoni Foundation. Your stories can be working while you relax at home. Imagine people retelling someone the story you told about your first day in your 9th class geometry class. Imagine an orator leaving a hall with your 3-minute story, filling audience with encouragement and inspiration. I take this opportunity to introduce to the audience the hour's topic, Stories That Feel Like Home, with history, heart and hint of magic with Reenita Malhotra Hora in conversation with Khushnur Chug. Today we have with us Ms. Reenita Malhotra Hora. She writes stories that reflect the South Asian experience. Her characters are gloriously flawed, fumbling through messy families, buried revolutions, magical blunders, and cultural chaos with wit and wonder. Novels, screenplays, audio dramas, whatever the medium, she stirs history, humor, and unapologetic Indian soul into one irresistible brew. Her award-winning historical love story, Vermillion Harvest, Playtime at the Bagh, set against the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre, clinched the overall grand prize at the Chanticleer International Book Awards, adding to her shelf of honors that includes the Eric Hoffer Book Award, Indie Reader Discovery Award, the Writers Lab, Sinestry Story Labs, Sundance Development Lab, Austin Film Festival, Santa Barbara International Screenplay Award, Script to Comic Launchpad, and Emerging Screenwriters. A former journalist, she is bylined the New York Times, CNN, Bloomberg, and Radio Television Hong Kong, and script edited for National Geographic Kids, Cartoon Network Asia, and Disney India. LA Weekly hails her as a top indie writer redefining Indian culture and comedy for global audiences. She hosts 2 hit narrative podcasts, True Fiction Project, where real stories morph into fictional retelling, and Shadow Realm, a mystical plunge into Indian myth and supernatural lore. I welcome you, ma'am, to the Orange City Literature Festival.
Thank you. Thank you.
Moderator of the session, Khushnur Chug, is born and brought up in Nagpur, having done her BA, LLB and Bachelor of Journalism from Nagpur University, started her working life as a coordinator for the Nagpur Management Association. She later worked as sub-editor cum reporter for the then leading daily Nagpur Times. Welcome, ma'am. Sorry, I left something. Married to Dr. Sanjeev Chug, she later pursued her career as a freelance journalist, juggling roles as a wife and mother. She took up the task of administering their nursing home until 2018. She has been the president of Rotary Club of Nagpur in 2015-16. She now devotes time to pursuing her hobbies, gardening being one of them. She now runs Flourish, which is an extension of her passion. As the topic itself is so very captivating that can make all of us to dwell deep into it, forgetting the time frame, I must appreciate the guests of this session for having accepted and structured this topic into a frame of 40 minutes, inclusive of the audience question hour. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I hand over the session to the dignitaries. Over to the moderator. Stories that feel like home with history, heart, and a hint of magic.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
You've had a hectic day. So I'm sure you all are looking forward to this session with Reenita, who is an amalgam of knowledge, expertise, understanding, and information. So should we dive right in? Reenita, let's start at the very beginning.
Okay.
What What is your earliest memory that made you feel like a storyteller? Do you remember the moment that sparked that clarity?
When I was a child, and inevitably people would ask you, what will you be? What do you want to be when you grow up? And I always said, I want to be a writer. And nobody took me seriously. But in my head, that is what I wanted to be. And when I was in school, I would write. My essays and stories would be published sort of in the school magazines, in an outside magazine, which was a big deal. I was 9 years old or 10 years old at that point, and then subsequently in middle school as well. And then my mother is, one of these people who, has this ardent trust in soothsayers. So there'd be some Jyotish and coming by. And I remember very clearly one of them looking at her and looking at me and saying, she will be a writer. And I was like, yes, somebody finally buys into what I'm saying,
Right.
Not exactly perhaps in those words, but that's exactly what was going through my head. So those are sort of my earliest memories. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a very strong influence on my life. And he was a writer, not a published writer. But he was a writer. He was a civil engineer by profession. Later on, when he retired, he became a lawyer. But he wrote his stories. He wrote his truth in his hand, in his handwriting. And I have all of those, or, a lot of his writings with me today. I was a child, and he gave them to me, and he said to me, promise me you'll go through them. You may not publish them, but if you do, you're going to have to change things around. And those were sort of my very first influences that really struck me as, my role in life would be that of a storyteller.
So basically that was an early influence which left a mark on you. Any place or any book that left a similar mark on you that you read, or you met someone and you thought, oh, well, I want to be that person? Anyone besides your grandfather?
I mean, there have been so many books. Writers are readers. So, I mean, the amount of books, that have really influenced me are immeasurable. But, if I talk about Vermillion Harvest, which is my historical fiction love story that, we're talking about today, the books that sort of influence that, or the idea of historical fiction or a love story, go back to when I was in the 11th standard in school. And one of my best friends said to me, you need to read this book. It's called Love Story by Eric Segal. And I said to her, I'm not into romances. This is not my jam. And she said, I know, but bear with me. This particular one, you're going to fall in love with. And I said, it's called Love Story. I mean, shouldn't that tell you that, it's just not my genre? And I picked up the book and I read it, mostly to get her off my back. And she was spot on. I fell in love with that story. And that's when I said to myself, one day I want to write an epic love story like this. And I'm going to fast forward several years to the age of the movie Titanic, if you remember that.
Yes.
Another epic love story set against a disaster, an accident, right, with ship goes down. And I saw it and I said, this reminds me, I know it's odd to say, but it reminds me of that Eric Segal story, Love Story, because it was a different premise, but sort of there was overlap.
Yes.
Yes. And this is another epic love story. And then fast forward again from there, I was writing quite a bit of young adult fiction. And John Green was out with a very famous book, what came to be a very famous book after that, The Fault in Our Stars, again, an epic love story, this time, in the guise of young adult fiction. And I think those three circumstances just drew me back to this incident of Jallianwala Bagh, which I had heard about in my childhood. And I knew I wanted to write a book about it, but I couldn't figure out over the course of years what it would be. And it was those three incidences that finally sort of came together, and I said, that's what my story is. It's going to be a love story set against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
Right.
So,
So we'll talk about that book later. But let me ask you, your career spans media, journalism, wellness, writing, and more. How did this multi-layered journey unfold? I believe you were into Ayurveda, or your family was into Ayurveda.
I was into
Tell us something
Ayurveda.
about
I am
that.
my family into Ayurveda. I'm a bored human being. I do not like to go with the norm. It's not that I intentionally like to buck the trend, but you know, the status quo is boring. So I like to explore outside of that, sort of paint beyond the lines. And when you grow up as a girl in a Punjabi family, often you are not given the opportunity to paint, you know, beyond the lines, because the answer is pretty much no to anything. But for me, that, you know, I have this issue with my son now, but I want to push boundaries to see how far I can get, you know, how much I can challenge the no that is. So I wanted to, you know, explore these different things. I wanted to work in my father's business, which was a razor blade business, and my upcoming book, Ace of Blades, is the story of, you know, his legacy, the Topaz and Supermax blades that, you know, the empire that he built with his own two hands. But again, as a girl in a Punjabi family, there is no place, you know, for you in a Punjabi family business. So there was no question, and that was a no. Unfortunately, that was a trend that I couldn't buck because there were too many sort of alpha males dominating that environment. But so I decided to go sort of totally in the other direction and explore Ayurveda. I had gone abroad to study. I did my BA in the US. And that in and of itself was a fight because I very much come from a traditional, conservative Punjabi family where education for girls is not really necessary. What's the point of that? You know, if you're too educated, you might be a little bit threatening to somebody we want to marry you off to, and that's more important. So I wasn't having any of that. So the story of how I managed to go abroad, that's a whole other thing. But that was definitely a trend that I bucked. But at the tail end of my BA, I decide that I also want to go traditionalist and I'm going to study Ayurveda. And my father was livid. He said, after all that, you fought with me, you basically left. You went on your, you know, you got this scholarship to escape from me. Now you want to go and study this poor man's medicine. What is wrong with you? What are you going to do with it? The what are you going to do with it was a good question because I couldn't quite answer that. By that time in my life, I had already met the man I was going to marry, and I knew I was going to live abroad. So how was I going to practice Ayurveda abroad? You know, I knew it wasn't going to happen. But I remember saying, you know, I'll figure it out, which is words my daughter uses on me now that drive me crazy. I'll figure it out. But that led to an Ayurvedic practice and writing, starting with one and what became 4 books on Ayurveda. And that was my foray into writing books, actually. Okay. Those were my very first books. So I was a nonfiction writer, specifically a health and wellness writer. One thing leads to another, and I become an environmental journalist. And then I moved to Hong Kong from the US, where at the time, they weren't really interested in environmental journalism. 1 story, 2 stories, that's fine. But then they were like, well, what do you know about money? This is one of the world's leading financial centers. And that essentially, you know, things changed. And by default, I became a financial journalist. This is how it happens. In print and on radio as well, which then led me to writing Money Smart, which is a guide, to personal investment for middle-class Indian women. You know, and it was in those days when I was working as a journalist in Hong Kong that I then wrote my first fictional books. And I loved fiction. It was such a different mindset, a totally different hat to wear from that of being a non-fiction writer, that I wrote more fiction after that. And lately I've been focusing on writing my fiction because, as I say to everybody, the world that exists in my head is so much more interesting than my real life, and I've been really trying to focus on my fiction. Having said that, I have a non-fiction book that's coming out in just a few days.
Oh, okay. Oh, so
Thank you.
How has your Indian heritage shaped the way you see the world and create your work?
My Indian heritage is my world, because this is the world that I live in, this is the world that I understand, this is the world that I can imagine in the case of fiction, right? I may not have been around in 1919, but because of my background as a Punjabi person and, having the understanding, having these stories sort of brought to me, told to me, infused into me, this is a world that I can recreate fairly easily with the research. The research skills come from my journalistic career.
And I can assure you, I have read her book, The Vermillion Harvest, and I assure you, I'm not a history buff like my husband. And her book really kept me glued to the last page, because Jallianwala Bagh never interested me as much as it interested me in her book. She has entwined romance and politics and what have you, passion, everything into it, and it's a lovely book.
Thank you.
And I know it has drawn inspiration from the stories that you heard from your grandfather. And I'd like you to talk about that heap of chappals, the story that your grandfather told you and stayed with you.
Absolutely. So again, the grandfather that I talked about, who was a staunch influence in my life and my life as a writer, was perhaps my first introduction to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, because he told us, his grandchildren and the family members, how he passed by the entrance of Jallianwala Bagh a few days after the massacre in 1919. And he was a young boy at the time. The visual that he saw and stuck in his mind was that of a pile of chappals, slippers, stacked up at the entrance. Now, what were these? They had gathered the chappals of the dead in order to redistribute to the living. India, is a land where people don't have footwear. Not today, of course. Today it's a different story. But certainly back then and in the days before that. So they had stacked up these chappals, and there was this pile of chappals stacked up, he had said, almost to the top of the wall, and it was so powerful and so visual and so grabbing, and for him as a young boy, what is this? Where are the people? Where are the feet that need to go into these chappals? And he couldn't make sense of it, and it really struck him. And what I found to be really interesting, as I had mentioned to you the other day when we spoke, was I've done a lot of book talks and conversations about this story. I live abroad in California, so a lot of them have happened there, a lot of them have happened, elsewhere in America as well. And I notice that when there is a room of Indian people who've read the book and we're doing a book talk, one of the first things that they say in every single session is that what struck me the most, or what struck me first, was that reference to the pile of chappals piled up outside the Bagh. That comment has never come from a Westerner. It has always come from an Indian, and it really seems to grab them and strike them. I thought that was very interesting.
Reenita, I'd also like you to talk about I see some young students here, and I'd like you to talk about the couple that you wrote about in your book, the Anglo-Indian girl and the Muslim boy, and how these things were taboo. They were, the communities were together, the Hindus and the Muslims, and all about that.
They were taboo, and they are, the idea of intermarriage, I would say, is still taboo in India. I mean, things are changing, and we do see
they
interfaith
are,
marriages.
but still there are.
But still, right? I have always been fascinated by this idea because when you live in America like I do, interfaith relationships and marriages and intercaste, intercommunity, that's the norm. You know, that's what everybody does. That's what, do I dare say, I'm probably expecting of my children if they ever go that way, you know. But in India, it's still a different story, right? We still, you know, go with your community first. And there's a lot to be said for that. So the idea of the interfaith marriage really, you know, struck me because conflict is already written into the picture. And while we have explored the idea of Hindu-Muslim marriages and relationships quite a bit, I have been obsessed for a very, very long time with the plight of the Anglo-Indian, right? The Anglo-Indian, half British blood, half Indian blood, because this was a community of people that were looked down upon by Indians and also by the British. They didn't have a place, neither here nor there. They lived in this sort of purgatorial state, okay? And the Anglo-Indian communities were very strong in places like Punjab, around Calcutta, perhaps where there were British Army cantonments and stations, right? Because often, most often, not always, but most often, they were children of British Army officers and local Indian women for whatever reason, right? Now, because they were this halfway community, neither accepted by the Indians, neither accepted by the British, they were given what the British considered to be menial government jobs. Menial government jobs, postings in the railways, in the post office, school teachers, deputy workers, post office workers, because these jobs were deemed to be too good for Indians. They were government jobs, so too good for Indians, but these were also jobs that either the British themselves didn't want to deal with, or there were not enough British in the country to actually fulfill these positions. So these were given to Anglo-Indians. And I remember in my journalistic years, my years as a journalist, interviewing this Anglo-Indian musician once, I was fascinated by his backstory. The interview was supposed to be about his music, and we did. We talked about that, but I was more interested in his backstory. And he really painted this picture about how outcast they felt. And it wasn't until his entire family had emigrated to a small town in England, I forget the town, and had settled there for a good 10, 15 years that they actually for the first time felt that they were finally part of something accepted.
They felt belonging.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? I have an Anglo-Indian friend in LA, in Los Angeles. Now she's Anglo-Indian because her grandmother was British. And when I was writing the book wasn't out yet, but she knew, and she knew I was writing about an Anglo-Indian, and she said to me, she said, so, she was very interested. She was like, you're writing about an Anglo-Indian? And then there were some other friends of ours, and she said, but you know, that's not me. That's not me. I'm not Anglo-Indian. And the rest of us sort of looked at her. It was interesting to see why it was problematic, you know. And she said, no, Anglo-Indians are people who were born in India, like I said, British Army officer with a local Indian woman. She was like, that's not me. My father or grandfather went abroad to England and he met, you know, his wife there. That is immaterial. The fact that that word was used, there's still a stigma. even today. And that breaks my heart. And these stories, when we look at history and historical fiction, we do not see stories being brought to audiences from the point of view of the woman, from the point of view of the minority, and certainly not the point of view of the Anglo-Indian.
Yes, that is what I found very interesting, because you had this little tadka of an Anglo-Indian girl in your story and what she was going through and what her mother was going through. It's an interesting read. You must read this book. Friends, we are really, really short of time and there's lots to talk to her yet. But from there, she's signing to me that I need to come to an end now. So we will have to end this conversation with Reenita. May you continue to write stories that feel like home, with history, heart, and a hint of magic.
Did you say will I or may I?
May you
may
always.
May I always. Thank you. I will take that with me because that is my ultimate dream and what I do.
Yes.
Thank you.
And being a full-time writer, like you emphasized, writing books and writing screenplay, may you continue to follow your passion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Krishna.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We can take questions from audience. We can take questions from audience.
Any questions? Yes?
Now that I've been listening to you, your band as a writer is huge, like writing non-fiction, finance, and then writing fiction and love story amongst all. So how do you do it? And basically, like when you're writing a book, so it requires some discipline, like writing regularly. Like how do you go about it?
So I always say I'm a very bored human being. So I have to explore sort of a multifaceted approach to stories and content. I used to be a financial journalist. I used to work for Bloomberg, and I had a finance show on radio, television, Hong Kong. So that's where the finance background comes from. But you know, the idea of a love story is something that has bugged me for a long time. In America, and I think the rest of the world as well, the romance market is the biggest market for books and stories, and I think films as well. But romance is not equal to love story. And I thought, how is that possible? What do you mean a romance? It's the same thing. A romance has a formula. It has to end in happily ever after or happy for now. If that formula is not met, then it is not a romance. So Love Story by Eric Segal, which is a book I had mentioned that had influenced me, is a love story, but not a romance. So this idea sort of intrigues me. Indian history, India in general, historical, cultural future at any point in time, I am obsessed with, I love with. Outside of India, I will say that I write South Asian stories. Inside India, I would not use the word South Asian, we're all South Asian, right? But for example, I'm working on a short film which is probably going to be a book as well. I haven't quite decided just yet, which is a story of the very first Indian immigrants in the USA. And these were the Gadarites. They were planning the Gadar Revolution from San Francisco, where I live, to overthrow the British Empire here. Why from there? Because the British spy network is par anon. So British spy network in India, so fabulous that it would be dangerous for them to actually plan the revolution here. So I have, India is my love, it's my interest. In all of my fiction books, I've got mother and daughter issues, whether it's historical fiction, whether it's young adult contemporary. I've got these Punjabi protagonists, whether it's my adult fiction book, my young adult book, my children's book. I didn't plan it that way. But, you can take the girl out of Punjab, but you can't take Punjab out of the girl. Thank you. Also, I must say to your question about how, there are not enough hours in a day, or days in a year, or years in a lifetime for me to ever be able to write all the stories that exist within me. Yeah, I need to just be locked away in a room, in a closet, left alone, and even then, there's not enough time. So I was telling Kushnur the other day, when people say writer's block, I don't understand what that means. Oh, thank you. Oh, a photo? Yes. I do hope you will check out my books. Vermillion Harvest is available downstairs, and Ace of Blades, my upcoming memoir of the founder of India's razor blade industry, is on pre-order right now. We authors really die for those Amazon rankings, so pre-order helps hugely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I do hope you check it out. And let me know what you think. I love hearing from my readers, I'm very curious as to what you think, how it resonates with you, what you want to see next, whether it made sense. And, there's so much more to talk about. I could go on all year.
I'm feeling that the conversation wasn't really complete and the time was up.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kesh. Your talk on today's topic, ma'am, you narrated your story, how you first was inspired to write, how your grandfather encouraged you to write. Also, you narrated the story of how Jallianwala Bagh story came in your mind and how to write it. Also, you talked about the plight of Anglo-Indians. After the freedom, there were 2 reserved seats in Lok Sabha. Which were meant only without any elections, those 2 seats were reserved. So those were included in Indian polity otherwise also. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you. Audience, I'm sure that you would be taking back a great spark of thoughts and ideas that were shared by our guests on the topic of this session. Thank you for joining us. We will meet you in the next session. Happy wisdom. Thank you.